welcome to Roots Action Education Fund's second ever monthly book club, now happening on the first Wednesday of every month, regardless of whether ABC or CBS likes it or not. My name's David Swanson. I'm delighted to be welcoming Mariah Blake, the author of an incredible book. I'm holding it up. I recommend it highly. This is a book that I hope you've read, but it's okay if you haven't. It's called They Poisoned the World: Life and Death in the Age of Forever Chemicals. Mariah Blake is an investigative journalist whose writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Mother Jones, The New Republic, and other publications. She was a Murray Marder Neiman Fellow in Watchdog Journalism at Harvard University. We are going to start with some questions from me and then go to the questions that you put into the chat. So you can put your questions into the chat at any time, including now. You can also get machine captions in English or other languages by clicking the CC button. And this is being recorded, and you will be sent the video along with any resources that come up in the conversation or in the chat. Mariah, thank you for being here. For those who haven't read the book or forgot or couldn't catch on, what exactly are forever chemicals?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to be speaking with all of you. So, forever chemicals, they're a large family of chemicals that are formally known as per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. And these chemicals have some pretty remarkable properties. So they're extremely resistant to heat, stains, grease, electrical currents. They stand up to chemicals that are so corrosive that they burn through most other materials, including steel in some cases. And this has made them incredibly useful. So they helped usher in the era of space travel and high-speed computing. They have enabled all kinds of life-saving medical devices, including, for example, patches for deteriorating veins and arteries. They've also transformed thousands of household items, everything from kitty litter and nail polish to dental floss, clothing, and furniture. They are in all of our homes. They are in all of our blood. So I guess the second thing I would say about them is that they are probably the most insidious pollutants in all of human history. So we're talking about a class of chemicals that take hundreds or even thousands of years to break down in the environment. And in fact, one industry document I came across in the course of my research estimated that a certain type of forever chemical, or PFAS, has a half-life of 1 million years. So that is way longer than plutonium. We are talking about a timescale that is more akin to nuclear waste than to ordinary chemicals. The ones that have been studied are extremely toxic, even in the most minuscule of doses, and they are literally polluting the entire planet, including human blood and ecosystems in the remotest parts of the world. So there's been a lot of talk about microplastics recently. These chemicals are arguably more ubiquitous than microplastics, more widespread in the environment and in our bodies. And whereas the science on microplastics and their health effects is relatively nascent, the science on PFAS or forever chemicals is extremely robust. So we know that they are harmful to human health in a variety of ways, and that all of us are exposed. So this is an issue that affects every single one of us. And I wish I need to turn off. So I'm apparently getting text messages. I'm not quite sure how to turn off that notification without turning off the sound on my computer. So if you have suggestions, I'd appreciate it.
We're not seeing any problems. You look and sound great. So,
Okay. So only I can hear it. All right.
as far as I know, yeah. So
Okay.
if I had any idea what it was or how to fix it, I'd tell you. But
Okay. Fair enough.
it doesn't seem to be a problem from our end. We know there are problems with these things, but there are people who knew there were problems with them long before anybody else did, and I think we'll talk about that. But I want to ask about about World War II as a fan of problems with wars. These forever chemicals, like standing armies, like nuclear weapons, like income taxes, like so many things that we all hold so dear, apparently came to a significant degree out of World War II. How did that happen?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that surprised me most in the course of researching my book because it's not the way the story has been told officially, but I dug into the archives, and what I discovered is that forever chemicals were developed by the US government as part of the top secret Manhattan Project. And the reason they were needed was for uranium enrichment. So uranium enrichment involves a certain chemical known as uranium hexafluoride that may be familiar to some people on the call here. And that chemical is so corrosive that it burns through stainless steel. So as I mentioned, so Manhattan Project scientists determined that the only substances that could contain uranium hexafluoride were substances that contained a combination of fluorine and carbon, two elements that together form the strongest bond in chemistry. And so they launched a program to develop and mass produce these chemicals. So this is the defining principle of PFAS, is this fluorine carbon bond. So just as there were physicists in labs all over the country working secretly to develop nuclear fuels and the bomb itself, there were chemists working in labs all over the country to develop what were then known as fluorocarbons and were what are now known as PFAS. Uh, it was clear almost from the beginning that this was very dangerous chemistry. So they were mass produced. By 1943, the US government was working with DuPont to mass produce these chemicals at a plant in New Jersey. And at this plant, fires and explosions were commonplace. Employees were constantly being hospitalized with breathing problems or chemical burns, sometimes worse. But it wasn't just employees who were affected. So within months of this plant going into operation, farmers downwind began complaining that their peach crops were shriveling, that their cows were so crippled they couldn't stand. They had to graze by crawling on their bellies. And in some cases, farmers who ate the produce they picked also fell ill. So the farmers' complaints really alarmed Manhattan Project officials, and they began secretly studying the health effects of PFAS as part of this broader program to study the health effects of secret Manhattan Project materials. I'm sorry, what were then known as special Manhattan Project materials. So as part of this program, they also studied uranium and plutonium, and in fact, they injected unknowing cancer patients with plutonium. So scientists working within this program had discovered by 1947 that these chemicals were highly toxic and that they were accumulating in human blood. So one of the things that makes these chemicals so uniquely harmful, besides the fact that they don't break down in the environment, is that they stay in the body for a long, long time. In many cases, people with high levels will carry them in their bodies until their death. So the US government had an indication of this as early as 1947. This is something that was not out there before I wrote my book. And interestingly, this program continued. I'm almost done, I promise. Interestingly, this program continued after the Manhattan Project under the auspices of the Atomic Energy Commission, which took over the bomb project. And by the 1970s, scientists working within this program had discovered that these chemicals were accumulating in the blood of people all over the United States, including in areas where there was no known source of contamination. I mean, think about that for a second. They knew that they were basically ubiquitous in the blood of people living in this country, but they withheld those findings. And in fact, they continue to withhold them even after all other Manhattan Project materials with no bearing on national security were declassified, specifically because of the potential liability to the US government and its contractors. So companies like DuPont that had indemnified the US government.
So By the way, I want to remind people to put your questions in the chat, and I'll ask them. Mariah, you're saying that from around 1947, people in the U.S. government, people in DuPont, and people in 3M knew some of these dangers?
So DuPont might have had some indication because it was running this plant, but DuPont was not involved in the secret medical studies. So it was really, things were, there's a lot of stovepiping in the Manhattan Project because it was, they were trying to keep it secret. So everybody just knew, they knew their own domain and they didn't know what else was happening in the project. So I don't think DuPont had the full picture. They knew what was happening in their plant, but it wasn't entirely clear whether that was a result of PFAS or of the feedstocks at that point. You know, a lot less was known, but the U.S. government knew. The U.S. government knew.
And if I may be recalling wrong, but I seem to recall in the book at some point these companies know 3M and
Yes.
DuPont long before now, long before the rest of us.
Oh, yes. Oh,
And
yes. I mean, it's decades. So after the war, Minnesota-based 3M licensed a technology to produce these chemicals and hired Manhattan Project chemists to turn them into substances that then could be marketed to the general public and also to other manufacturers. So one of the earliest products made from these chemicals was Scotchgard, the fabric protector, which maybe less now, but if you remember, you know, the 1990s, it was in everything. Um, it's used on clothing and leather jackets and furniture to make it stain proof. So almost anything that you have in your home that's stain proof, waterproof, uh, probably has PFAS in it, whether it be, whether it be Scotchgard or there's thin barriers of Teflon. Um, so yeah, and then DuPont began mass producing Teflon using an additive that was produced by 3M. So Teflon is a form of plastic, but it needed certain additives in order to be manufactured at scale. And both companies were very, very early on that these chemicals were dangerous. So as early as 1960s, the 1960s, they were aware that they were toxic. And in fact, I think in the case of 3M, it was a little bit earlier in the 1950s. By the 1970s, they knew that they were accumulating in the blood of people all over this country. And in fact, the way they learned that was one of these scientists working in the bomb project. Basically, he guessed that it was a 3M product that was accumulating in the blood of people all across this country. So he brought that information to 3M. 3M denied that it was a 3M product, but internally they determined that it was a 3M product. And so 3M began intensively studying the prevalence of these chemicals in human blood. They tested thousands of samples from people all over the world, including remote rural China. And this is another shocker, but the only blood they could find that did not contain these chemicals was collected from Korean war vets before 1952. So before these chemicals went into wide-scale production. So the manufacturers of these chemicals knew by the 1980s, and some of the research was done in the 90s, that basically every person on the planet was walking around with these chemicals in their blood. Now, not surprisingly, these findings set off some alarm bells inside DuPont and 3M, and they began intensively studying their effects on human health and the environment as well. They discovered pretty early on that these chemicals did not break down in the environment. So this is one of the things that makes them uniquely problematic. They also found that they had a devastating effect on lab animals. So in the 1970s, they tested one of the two best known PFAS on monkeys. They chose monkeys because they were biologically more similar to humans than lab rats. All of the monkeys died. All of them. When they started looking at the effects on people, the results were equally troubling. So, they found that in their workers, particularly in workers in 3M's plant and in a couple of cases in DuPont's Teflon factories, they found that these chemicals were associated with kidney cancer, prostate cancer, leukemia, dramatic drops in testosterone among male workers, organ damage. But even more alarming, they found that they were associated with birth defects. So in the 1970s, 3M had conducted a study that found that PFOA, which is the type of forever chemical that is used in Teflon or was used in Teflon, caused birth defects in the eyes of the children of rats that were exposed in utero. So in the eyes of rats that were exposed in utero is what I mean. And DuPont decided that it would try to determine whether the same was true of its workers. So in 1981, it launched what it called a pregnancy outcome study. And the goal, according to internal DuPont documents, was to determine whether PFOA caused abnormal children. Those were the words that were used in the internal government documents. And in fact, the answer seemed to be yes. 2 of 7 pregnant women that gave birth during the course of the study gave birth to children with serious facial deformities, very similar to the ones found in rats. But rather than inform the public or workers, DuPont canceled the study and continued exposing women in its plants to these chemicals. And I think more importantly, or perhaps more importantly, by this point, DuPont and 3M knew that these chemicals were getting into the drinking water around their plants. DuPont had actually determined that that the drinking water around its main Teflon plant contained levels that were higher than its internal safety standard. So it set certain internal safety standard. But it didn't inform the public about that either. And in fact, there were very simple steps it could have taken to filter PFOA, this chemical, out of the air and water, so the discharges from its plant. But it didn't take those steps. It opted not to take them. There were explicitly meetings where they discussed installing filters, and they decided not to, because any future liability would be incremental. That was the exact language they used, compared to the liability they'd already amassed for spreading this chemical for the last 32 years. That's a long answer.
But it's an important answer, and the
Yeah.
very end of it there is horrific, because this is treating damage to humans and their environment forever as a cost of doing business in the very short term. And
Yes.
I'm pretty impressed. I mean, there's other, I think, maybe more better known cases of companies knowing something and lying about it and continuing the practice. People are widely aware of when ExxonMobil knew about what fossil fuels do. There was, a famous congressional hearing where all the cigarette company CEOs lied, right? And so I don't know if there's been such a hearing in this case or why it is, but my impression is these guys have done a better job of not being known as horrific, horrible, destructive liars than some of these other industries. I mean, it's pretty impressive.
I guess you could call it that. Yeah. I think one thing I'd like to mention here is that these are chemicals that are used in countless everyday products. So they're in lipstick and diapers and children's clothing and cell phones and furniture and dental floss. These exotic chemicals that were developed for use in the nuclear weapons program are in all of our homes. So this is not just an issue that affects people living in polluted communities, or heavily polluted communities, because all communities are polluted by these chemicals. This is an issue that affects all of us. And the actual main route of exposure for most people is food. So food and then consumer products. So I mean, I just want to sort of, because I think the conversation about these chemicals often tends to revolve around drinking water contamination, because that's what's been in the headlines the most. But that's just one small piece of the puzzle. And it's an important piece of the puzzle. So whether they're better at hiding it, I mean, it took longer it took longer for the public to become aware that this was happening, and it hasn't gotten as much attention as, say, what ExxonMobil did or what Big Tobacco did. But I think among people that are aware of these chemicals, there there is very people those people so the people who are paying attention are very aware of the deception, and it it has galvanized them. So there is a powerful movement of unlikely activists out there, fighting to turn off the tap on these chemicals. And this is something that I think, and actually making pretty remarkable headway. And those people, part of what drives them is anger at the deception. So
Yeah. Some of
so
the in this book, some of a big chunk of this book is the stories of some of
yeah,
them.
yeah.
Um, Let me ask some questions out of the chat. There's a question from Frank who asks, have companies known for polluting the environment with PFAS, forever chemicals, reduced its use now in their manufacturing? He says, I live in Michigan. I think you could live on Earth and this would be relevant. But if not, do you think that it's possible to pass legislation to eliminate their use?
Oh, that is a really good and interesting question, and the answer is complicated. So, the two best known and best studied PFAS, the PFOA and PFOS, and it's a little confusing because the acronyms are all very similar, but those have actually been phased out. They were phased out in theory a decade ago. It was a voluntary phase out. So they are still being used in this country and emitted in this country, but in smaller quantities than they were before. However, when industry phased out these chemicals, they just replaced them with other PFAS. So the older generation had longer carbon chains. So you have a carbon chain swaddled in fluorine. And the newer ones have shorter carbon chains. And industry argued that the ones with shorter carbon chains were less harmful, that they were less toxic. In fact, we are now discovering that some of them are even more toxic than the chemicals they replaced. And in other ways, they are far more problematic. So they move more readily through the environment. So these chemicals differ from most other chemicals in that they are extremely mobile because they are hydrophilic. So a lot of chemicals, for example, accumulate in fat. These chemicals are attracted to water, and because they're attracted to water, they move through the upper atmosphere and fall with rain all around the world. That's one of the reasons they're so widespread in the environment. So that is even more true of the newer generation than it was of the older generation. They also build up more quickly in crops. So as a result, that leads to higher concentrations in foods and more rapid accumulation in the food chain, and they are more difficult to remove from drinking water. So, and in fact, we're discovering now that some of them are impossible to remove from drinking water. So, one of my sources compared it to cutting off the head of the Hydra and it sprouting 100 new heads. Um, so, PFAS emissions generally in this country and worldwide, they have not decreased. I mean, this isn't very carefully tracked. However, scientists recently discovered a type of PFAS that they weren't even aware existed that's more abundant in the environment than all others combined. It's a certain molecule, and that is accumulating extremely rapidly, which has caused concern among scientists. So the problem, we are nowhere close to solving this problem. But there was another piece to that question, I believe, which was, is there a policy solution to this? And the answer is probably not on a federal level. Probably not on a federal level, but something really remarkable is happening. So I talked a little bit earlier about this unlikely citizen activist movement. So this is people all over the country. And it might help if I just give a little context here, which is that at this point, more than half of Americans are known to be drinking water that's contaminated with these chemicals, many of them at levels that are higher than the EPA safety standard. We know that millions of acres of farmland are polluted with PFAS from sewage sludge that's been spread over them as fertilizer. And there's been a lot of studies about their prevalence in consumer goods. So there are a lot of people, whose lives have been deeply and personally affected by this, and they've spanned the gamut in terms of politics. There's farmers, firefighters, factory workers, suburban moms, and they are really pushing hard. They're pushing politicians to take actions to restrict these chemicals. They're pushing for polluters to be held accountable, and they are making remarkable headway. And I think the clearest example of this is state level legislation. So far, 30 US states have passed more than 200 bills restricting PFAS, including at least 16 full or partial bans on the entire class of chemicals in consumer goods, and even more on the entire class of chemicals in firefighting foam, which is a major source of PFAS contamination in the environment. So this is a paradigm shift, because that's not how we regulate chemicals in this country. Normally, we regulate them one by one. And as a result of that, we get situations like what we got with, the trading the longer chain PFAS for the shorter chain PFAS, or there's a million other examples. In public health circles, it's called regrettable substitution, where you phase out a given chemical and you replace it with other chemicals that have a similar structures and properties, and those chemicals end up being just as harmful. So this model where you regulate the entire class of chemicals has the potential to solve that problem. And in fact, so the EU is also, next year, they are going to ban the entire class of chemicals unless industry lobbyists manage to undermine that process. So this approach has been spawned by the unique threat posed by these chemicals, but now regulators on the state level and also in the European Union are using this same approach to regulate other classes of chemicals that are known to be harmful. So things like phthalates and phenols. The other thing that's happening that's pretty remarkable is there's a tidal wave of litigation surrounding PFAS. So far, manufacturers have been hit by at least 15,000 lawsuits. This legal battle is going to dwarf the legal battle between big tobacco and states. It's going to dwarf asbestos litigation. It's going to dwarf any other similar wave of litigation in US history. It's going to be mammoth. And the reason is because these chemicals are so ubiquitous in our economy. So what you're starting to see happen now is lawsuits against consumer brands, the makers of Band-Aids and Snapple and Trojan condoms. And I think there was one against Coca-Cola that got dismissed. Brands that sell products that contain these chemicals and don't disclose it. And that has the potential to hit just huge swaths of the economy. So as a result of these two pressures, the rising tide of legislation and and litigation, what you have is major companies moving away from PFAS en masse. So 3M, which has been the main manufacturer of these chemicals since they went into commercial production in the 1940s and 50s, has announced that it will get out of the market by the end of this year. So it will quit producing PFAS. 40 major retail chains with nearly $2 trillion in combined annual sales have announced that they are going to eliminate or radically reduce PFAS in their packaging and products. And we're talking huge companies: Amazon, Home Depot, McDonald's, Apple. The list is really quite long. So I think that I personally believe, and I think, I've talked to a lot of experts, that these factors have the potential to move us towards turning off the tap on PFAS much faster than regulation, because regulation moves slowly and markets move fast. And also, our entire regulatory system in this country on a federal level is, the EPA has very weak authority. So I think I do think that there is a potential for a regulatory solution, especially when you combine it with the threat of lawsuits and the enormous liability that creates for companies.
What I was really struck by as well, Mariah, in the book was that this so-called federal regulation of chemicals all comes after the fact. Like first, the chemicals are free to use. Anything new you invent, put it out there, see if it kills anybody, and then we'll regulate it rather than test it first, get it approved first, and then put it out there. And I was struck by how it came to be that way.
Oh, yeah.
And then what was done when Biden was in the White House, and then what was done when Trump was in the White House. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so there's a lot to that question. But I think that the key point is that our system for regulating potentially toxic substances presumes that they are safe until proven otherwise. And this is enshrined in our law. So the main law governing chemical safety in this country, it was passed in the 1970s, and under the law, all chemicals that were in existence at that time were presumed safe and grandfathered in. Now that is the vast majority of chemicals that are circulating in our country today. But even more surprising, even new chemicals weren't required to be vetted for safety under most circumstances. So if companies happen to have information that indicated that a chemical posed a substantial risk, that's the EPA's language, then they were obliged to turn it over to the EPA, but they could really determine for themselves, what met that different definition and what didn't. So as a result of this, the vast majority of the 80,000 chemicals that are in circulation today have never undergone any form of safety testing, excuse me. And that is something that really, really shocked me when I first learned it. In fact, when I first learned it, I was pregnant with my son. It was 2010. And I think that is one of the reasons that I felt compelled to pursue this issue, to spend years of my life investigating toxic chemicals.
I was of course wrong to mention Biden being around when something happened. This was the first
It was
Trump
during the first
visit,
Trump
right? That,
administration.
uh,
Well, many things happened under Biden too, but I think what you're referring to happened in 2016.
right.
So in 2016, Congress passed a law that would overhaul the Toxic Substances Control Act. That's the law I was referring to before that governs toxic chemicals in this country. And the law passed by a broad bipartisan margin and with the support of industry, because they knew that consumers were losing faith in the safety of chemicals. And what that law required is a logical approach to regulating chemicals. So, uh, one, chemicals would have to be tested for safety before they went onto the market. Makes sense, right? And two, even existing chemicals would have to be vetted for safety. Now, some of the language in the law made the process ponderous, so it would have taken quite a long time. Uh, but it was a huge step forward, a huge win for public health. And under the first Trump administration, excuse me, he put people in high posts in the EPA, specifically the Office of Chemical Safety, who had been lobbyists for the chemical industry. And they set about basically, it had to do with the way the law was implemented. So during the rule writing process, they worked to essentially defang this law. And that process has continued under the new Trump administration. In fact, some of the former industry lobbyists who were in the first Trump EPA are also in the second Trump EPA. So they've continued that work. And I think that is an underappreciated loss for public health. That, because it's not just this class of chemicals. There are thousands of chemicals that are out there that are known to be harmful, especially to developing fetuses and young children, and that children are born with hundreds of these chemicals in their bodies. So, but because the way the law works, because you need such overwhelming evidence to regulate chemicals once they're on the market, it's very difficult to protect public health.
Here is a question from Michelle in the chat. Can forever chemicals be filtered out of contaminated water? Is there any way to do that?
So, yes. Um, on a utility scale, if you have a polluted drinking water system, there's really only one option that's feasible in most cases, and that is activated carbon, specifically granulated activated carbon, and sometimes it's combined with other technologies. And that is highly effective at removing the longer chain PFAS, the older generation of PFAS. But the shorter the chain gets, the less effective it is. So I mentioned that there's a certain molecule that it's recently discovered is more abundant in the environment than all others combined. We already have some information indicating that it is highly toxic, that it is specifically damaging to reproductive health. Um, those systems can't remove it at all. The systems that many communities in this country have installed at great expense to taxpayers and ratepayers, because it usually falls on taxpayers and ratepayers, are not removing many PFAS. Are removing a share of PFAS, but there are a number that are not being removed. Now, if you're looking to protect your family, you can install reverse osmosis, and that removes all of them. It's not feasible on a utility scale, but you can get something that goes under your sink and removes them. And the studies that have been done show that the most effective for removing the shorter chains, if you want a home system, and for most people, under sink is the best option, especially if you're on a public water supply. The most effective systems besides reverse osmosis are multi-stage systems that involve activated carbon and something else. So, and this is something that maybe you can circulate after the fact, but
Sure.
there's an organization called NSF that has certifications. So you want to look for certifications. You want to look for systems that are certified to remove PFAS. And there's two numbers. One is for reverse osmosis, and the other one is, for other systems that remove PFAS.
Roughly, what does it cost somebody to do something like that?
A couple $100 plus the filters. So the system I have, I think, cost me $200. I have an undersink system, and I got a second one for my refrigerator line. I don't have reverse osmosis. I'm considering it now that, more data is coming out about the newer generation. It's hard to keep up, but that's what I do, and that's what I recommend my friends and family do.
There's a question in the chat from Rosalind. I was struck by the role that religious belief played in the early developers, and the similarity of quasi-religious faith in the power of technological progress to solve society's problems in today's tech bros ideas.
That's a really interesting parallel that I hadn't thought about. Yeah, so there's an interesting dimension of this story, which is, it's easy to think of the people who made some of these decisions as cartoon villain caricatures, but actually their reasoning was more complicated than that. So Robert Kehoe was the industry funded scientist who first articulated this principle that underlies our system for regulating toxic chemicals. And he also developed the methods that big tobacco and other industries use to manipulate science to the benefit of industry. This was in the 1920s during the war over leaded gasoline. But the language that she used in her question is drawn directly from my description of Kehoe, that he had this almost religious faith in the power of these substances to transform society for the better, and that any downsides were outweighed by the potential benefits to humanity. And there were a lot of people in the early days, inside these companies who thought in that way. So the head of DuPont's synthetic chemical division, he was the son of a preacher, and he talked about the potential of chemistry and I can't remember the exact language, but you know, that man could transform society in a way that even God could not. So giving humans godlike potential to transform society for the better. Um, and I think the piece of this that is similar to the way tech bros think is that it was this paternalistic mentality where they decided that it was okay that these chemicals were in all of our blood because in their minds the benefits outweighed the risks. Uh, and but all of us, it was put in our bodies without our knowledge and consent. So it was, they almost saw them. Yeah, it would. And I think that there's a,
Gods don't ask for consent.
yeah, exactly. So I think that there's a similar sort of paternalism among, I don't even want to say the tech bros, the tech elite, right? I mean, not the people, not the coders, but the tech billionaires. Uh,
Yeah.
so I think that's a really interesting observation, and I really appreciate it because I hadn't made that connection. But I think it's a smart uh, it's a smart thought.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit, Mariah, about the extent of the role of the U.S. military in this to this day, not just back in the origins in the Manhattan Project, but military bases around the world.
Yeah.
If the EU were to ban this stuff, what about all the hundreds of US military bases that claim the right to do whatever they want and the EU can have nothing to do with it? And what about the announcement in the past week from the Department of War that they're going to delay dealing with this stuff, here in the so-called homeland?
Yeah, this is a fascinating and underappreciated dimension of this story. And that is, so the US government is one of the largest sources of PFAS contamination worldwide. So in the 1960s, the Pentagon collaborated with 3M to develop this highly effective firefighting foam that has been used on virtually every military base, fire station, and airport around the world since. And it's made from PFAS. Uh, and so military bases are some of the most contaminated sites anywhere in the world. The groundwater around many of the military bases in this country has levels of PFAS that are 100 million times the EPA's safety standard, or in that range. So mind-blowing levels. And the same is true of wildlife. In some cases, the runoff is affecting drinking water. The runoff is affecting farms. In my home state of New Mexico, there was a dairy that was forced to euthanize thousands of cows because the drinking water wells were polluted by a nearby military base. Uh, so yeah, and the U.S. military has resisted cleanup. It has defied EPA orders. It has sued states that have tried to enforce their own cleanup standards. So this is something that's been going on for quite some time. My it's actually, I think the Pentagon has sued my home state of New Mexico twice over this. Uh, and so and but partially as a result, because there's of this sort of citizen activism movement that I talked about, a large contingent is people, military families. Um, and so beginning in 2019, as a result of their advocacy and the advocacy of, the legislators in their district and environmental groups, Congress passed a series of laws that were designed to actually protect military people living near military bases, and by extension, all of us, from these chemicals. So they actually banned PFAS in firefighting foam. They made it illegal to incinerate PFAS based. So they phased it out, I should say. So they're supposed to be phasing it out around now. They made it illegal to incinerate this foam, because what happens when you incinerate PFAS, unless the incinerators are hot enough, it just spreads them further afield. So military bases are incinerating this stuff and basically just spreading a plume of pollution over huge areas. And by the way, there's only 3 incinerators in the entire country that can actually destroy these chemicals. So this is one of the big issues with them. There is no way to dispose of them. Um, so, but there were, there were a number of measures that were in effect, and the Pentagon had announced under pressure that it was going to begin cleanup by a certain date. Now, it recently announced that it is delaying that cleanup by, I think the timeframes vary, but you also have Republicans in Congress moving to delay or repeal the phase out, to repeal the ban on incineration. So this is all happening right now, and it's not really getting any attention. Uh, and it has huge implications for human health because the groundwater that's contaminated, these plumes move through aquifers, and they're a major source. They will contribute to the total amount of these chemicals in the environment. So that is a huge issue. I think there's probably part of your question I didn't answer. Uh,
I'm sure
but
there is, but that was a good answer, and I've got more
uh,
questions keep piling up in my mind.
so I want, like, so there's a military base in my home state of New Mexico, just to give you a sense of the scale of the contamination. The wildlife and plants around that site have the highest level of contamination detected anywhere in the world. So one of the rodents that was collected from that site has levels in its body that are 34 million times the EPA safety standard for the two best studied of these chemicals in drinking water. And so, I mean, we don't really have the technology to remediate that level of contamination. I mean, we don't have the technology to dispose of them generally, but what the contamination around military bases, even if the military was willing to clean it up, the expense would be staggering. And really, there's only so much that they can do to remediate it. And I think the bigger issue here is that because these chemicals persist in the environment for so long, because the ones that are out there can continue to be there, when our great 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 grandchildren are born, presuming we make it that long. The only solution is to turn off the tap. So the part about this that's most concerning to me about what's happening in terms of firefighting foam and military bases is the move uh, to roll back the ban on the phase out of PFAS-based firefighting foam. And that's also happening, I should say, in other places. Like, a lot of states are banning PFAS-based firefighting foam, and that is thanks largely to firefighters. So firefighters all over this country are fighting for these bans, and I believe at least 18 states, because as states start investigating the source of pollution, in many cases they're discovering that the main source of drinking water contamination is firefighting foam. So this is something that I think is fascinating and inspiring, that you have firefighters unions sending firefighters on every level of government to push for banning PFAS in firefighting foam and also in firefighting gear, and they are making a lot of headway. So their efforts are, they'll protect all of us because this foam is such a major source of PFAS in the environment. And firefighters didn't know that. They were told that this stuff was safe as soap, even though manufacturers knew it was toxic, since the 1960s, 1970s. The U.S. military, which developed them, had determined very early on that it was toxic, and it actually figured out a way to filter these chemicals out of water that was seeping off bases, but chose not to deploy it. So, but firefighters, when they learned that this was an issue, they began organizing to ensure that, to protect their own health, because firefighters are highly exposed and they have very high rates of PFAS linked cancers. Cancer is the number one cause of death among firefighters. But in the process, just as they do in their daily lives and work, they're protecting the rest of us, which, is is a nice counterpoint to what's happening with the U.S. military at the moment.
I want to ask about state level legislation, but first I just want to ask quickly the extent of its power, because I know U.S. military bases in some foreign countries have, denied the countries they're in the right to do anything about what's happening on those bases. If a state bans something, does it ban it on U.S. military bases within that state or not?
Um, the military has fought that, right? I mean, has fought. I don't think they've necessarily, I don't know if they've fought bans on PFAS-based firefighting foam, but they have fought state cleanup standards. So I think that's an important question. I mean, the thing is, it wasn't really an issue because in 2019, Congress passed a law that was supposed to phase PFAS-based firefighting foam out on military bases. So this was not an issue that was being debated. Everyone thought this was going to happen this year. They were supposed to be phased out this year. It was supposed to be phased out this year. So I think that's a really interesting question, and I think we're going to have to see how it plays out.
Well, at least for locations that are not military bases, a state legislation seems like a terrific thing. And at Roots Action, we very often take like a great piece of legislation that's been passed in one state and say, hey, to the other 49 states, everybody flood your state legislators with this recommendation to do what this one state has done. Do you think that's a useful approach in this case? Are there states that you would recommend as having done the best, most usefully duplicated legislation on this?
So 100%, 100%. I think Maine and Minnesota has the most aggressive law. And it's an interesting story, actually. I'd like to share the story of how that law came to be.
A 3M state.
It's the home state of 3M. So in 2022, the Minnesota State Legislature began weighing a blanket ban on PFAS in all consumer products. And similar bills had been weighed during past sessions and hadn't gotten any traction. So lawmakers were pessimistic that this bill would actually pass. Then a young woman named Amara Strande started showing up at state legislative sessions. Now, Amara Strande had grown up in the area of 3M's headquarters, an area that has the largest plume of PFAS drinking water contamination anywhere in the country. And she went to a high school where an extraordinary number of students had been diagnosed with cancer. And she herself had been diagnosed with a rare form of liver cancer at age 15. And by the time she showed up to testify, she was dying. So she showed up to every single hearing and she would testify about how the tumors that were expanding in her chest, she testified about having a 15-pound tumor removed from her abdomen, how the tumors that were expanding in her chest were cracking her ribs. I think it was compressing the nerves so that she couldn't move her hand. They were strangling her vocal cords. You could hear it in her voice. She did not live to see the outcome of her advocacy. She died just shy of her 21st birthday. But a few weeks later, Minnesota passed the most aggressive PFAS ban in the country. Minnesota, the home of 3M.
Wow.
The largest manufacturer of PFAS and really the reason that PFAS are so widespread in this world. So I think that's a heartbreaking story. I mean, and I think in many of these stories, it's people who have suffered unimaginable loss who are out there advocating. But I think that there's almost everything about the Minnesota bill is worth emulating. So the Minnesota bill has an exception, but only for uses that are essential to the health, safety, and functioning of society, and when there is no other alternative available. And that is, so industry has lobbied for all kinds of exemptions for, entire categories like fluorinated plastics like Teflon. They say they're essential for lithium ion batteries. And in fact, they are. For the cathodes of lithium ion batteries, we don't have anything else that works for that now. But you
Are
don't
the
need to.
batteries essential for our safety and survival?
Well, I think they are probably essential to the transition to green energy. And so for that reason. But the thing is that that's just a tiny portion of the fluorinated plastics that are used, right? The rest of them, you can ban them for all by that very specific purpose.
Yeah.
And so other states are doing the same thing. The EU ban includes the same language. And because it's so stringent, companies are having to go through their entire supply chains and identify all of the uses and then justify which ones are essential and which ones are not. And once that information becomes public, it is a huge PR liability for these companies. And that's part of the reason that they are shifting away from PFAS in mass. So I think you also have some states are banning the application of sewage sludge because of PFAS. Maine is actually the one state that's done that. So I think that, and these states are, so now you have a farmer in Maine, an organic farmer whose farm was ruined by sewage sludge that had been spread over his fields by the owner 2 owners ago, who now is organizing farmers around the country to advocate for bans on sludge application. And you have bills cropping up in legislatures in deep red states like Oklahoma and Texas. Montana is weighing a consumer product ban. So you do have states adopting adopting similar legislation. You have organizations working across states to try to get good legislation replicated. And it's been very effective. So
Yeah.
there's only one state. New Mexico passed a bad consumer product ban that includes these huge loopholes for entire categories. But all other states have adopted this very strict definition that, the EPA's definition of PFAS would exempt entire hugely important categories. But states are sticking to their guns, even when you have industry pouring huge sums into lobbying in states. They're forming front groups, but states are not budging. So I think it's a very, what's
Yeah.
happening on a state level with PFAS is model, what's happening in individual states is not model, not just for other states, but a model for, how you make progress on environmental and social issues during the Trump era, right? That it's state and local governments are more responsive to individuals, and the courts to a certain degree. The courts are also playing a big role in this. We'll,
But it's great to have those examples and to have that trend and to have that story, that inspiring story of personal suffering that helped make it happen in Minnesota, which we can take to all the other states. I
yeah.
think it's terrific. We're almost out of minutes, and I wanted to try to squeeze in one more question that's in the chat. I have no idea what the answer is, which is, do we have the technology to measure the amount of the forever chemicals in an individual? And can an individual get that technology?
So we do have the ability to measure it in blood, and there have been studies that measured it. I mean, different PFAS accumulate in different organs. So in the brain, in the testicles, in the liver. So we have it for at least a subset of these chemicals. And in fact, you can ask your doctor to get blood tests. And there's a code. You can look up what the code is. The challenge people might run into is that doctors are not necessarily educated, and they may not. So the thing is that there are health effects that are associated with ordinary populations' levels of exposure. So the level that the average American carries around in their blood, and your doctor may not be aware of that. So you would probably have to educate yourself so that you can advocate for yourself effectively. But yes, most of them, or not most of them, but at least, there is a subset of them that can be tested for. So I guess I would just like to say I have a website. It's mariahblake.com. There's information on how to get blood testing, and there's also a lot of resources, information on how to protect your drinking water, interactive databases where you can see, where the drinking water contamination is. There's just a lot of resources people can access for specific steps they can take to protect themselves and their families. And another resource I would recommend to people is the Environmental Working Group. I link to some of their tools, but they have a lot of excellent tools that help people protect themselves, not just from PFAS, but from all kinds of toxic chemicals. And I have one ask, if that's okay. So, if you read the book and enjoyed it, please consider writing a review because that really helps in terms of encouraging other people to pick up the book. And this is an issue I care deeply about and want to make sure as many people as possible know about.
Wonderful. And if you haven't got it yet, it's absolutely terrific place to start. They Poisoned the World, Life and Death in the Age of Forever Chemicals by Mariah Blake. Mariah, thank you very much for writing this book and for coming on our second ever monthly book club. We really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed talking to you, and I really appreciate people's smart questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.